The King of Ireland's Son by Patrick Collum, with illustrations and decorations by Willie Pogani. Fedelma, the Enchanter's Daughter. Conall was the name of the king who ruled over Ireland at that time. He had 3 sons, and as the fir trees grow, some crooked and some straight, one of them grew up so wild that in the end the king and the king's counselor had to let him have his own way in everything. This youth was the king's eldest son, and his mother had died before she could be a guide to him. Now after the king and the king's counselor left him to his own way, the youth I'm telling you about did nothing but ride and hunt all day. Well, one morning he rode abroad, his hound at his heel, his hawk on his wrist, a brave steed to carry him whither he list, and the blue sky over him. And he rode on until he came to a turn in the road. There he saw a gray old man seated on a heap of stones, playing a game of cards with himself. First he had one hand winning, and then he had the other. Now he would say, "That's my good right," and then he would say, "Play and beat that, my gallant left." The King of Ireland's son sat on his horse to watch the strange old man, and as he watched him he sang a song to himself. "I put the fastenings on my boat for a year and for a day, and I went where the rowans grow and where the moorhens lay, and I went over the stepping stones and dipped my feet in the ford, and I came at last to the swineherd's house, the youth without a sword. A swallow sang upon his porch, gluey, 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 the wonder of all wandering, the wonder of the sea. A swallow soon to leave the ground sang gooly, gooly, gooly." "Prince," said the old fellow, looking up at him, "if you can play a game as well as you can sing a song, I'd like it if you would sit down beside me." "I can play any game," said the King of Ireland's son. He fastened his horse to the branch of a tree and sat down on the heap of stones beside the old man. "What shall we play for?" said the old gray fellow. "Whatever you like," said the King of Ireland's son. "If I win, you must give me anything I ask, and if you win, I shall give you anything you ask. Will you agree to that?" "If it is agreeable to you, it is agreeable to me," said the King of Ireland's son. They played, and the King of Ireland's son won the game. "Now what do you desire me to give, King's son?" said the old gray fellow. "I shan't ask you for anything," said the King of Ireland's son, "for I think you haven't much to give." "Never mind that," said the gray old fellow. "I mustn't break my promise, and so you must ask me for something." "Very well," said the king's son. "Then there's a field at the back of my father's castle, and I want to see it filled with cattle tomorrow morning. Can you do that for me?" "I can," said the gray old fellow. "Then I want 50 cows, each one white with a red ear, and a white calf going beside each cow." "The cattle shall be as you wish." "Well, when that's done, I shall think the wager has been paid," said the King of Ireland's son. He mounted his horse, smiling at the foolish old man, who played cards with himself, and who thought he could bring together 50 white cattle, each with a red ear, and a white calf by the side of each cow. He rode away, his hound at his heel, his hawk at his wrist, a brave steed to carry him whither he list, and the green ground under him. And he thought no more of the gray old fellow. But in the morning he was taking his horse out of the stable. He heard the grooms talking about a strange happening. Art, the king's steward, had gone out and had found the field at the back of the castle filled with cattle. There were 50 white, red-eared cattle there, and each cow had a white calf at her side. The king had ordered Art, his steward, to drive them away. The King of Ireland's son watched Art and his men trying to do it, but no sooner were the strange cattle put out at one side of the field than they came back on the other. Then down came Maravan, the king's counselor. He declared that they were enchanted cattle, and that no one on Ireland's ground could put them away. So in the 7-acre field the cattle stayed. When the King of Ireland's son saw what his companion of yesterday could do, he rode straight to the glen to try if he could have another game with him. There at the turn of the road, on a heap of stones, the grey old fellow was sitting playing a game of cards, the right hand against the left. The King of Ireland's son fastened his horse to the branch of a tree and dismounted. "Did you find yesterday's wager settled?" said the grey old fellow. "I did," said the King of Ireland's son. "Then shall we have another game of cards on the same understanding?" said the grey old fellow. "I agree if you agree," said the King of Ireland's son. He sat under the bush beside him, and they played again. The King of Ireland's son won. "What would you like for me to do for you this time?" said the grey old fellow. Now the king's son had a stepmother, and she was often cross-tempered. And that very morning he and she had vexed each other. So he said, "Let a brown bear, holding a burning coal in his mouth, put Kentigern, the queen, from her chair in the supper-room tonight." "It shall be done," said the grey old fellow. Then the King of Ireland's son mounted his horse and rode away, his hound at his heel, his hawk on his wrist, a brave steed to carry him whither he list, and the green ground under him. And he went back to the castle. That night a brown bear, holding a burning coal in his mouth, came into the supper-room and stood between Kentigern, the queen, and the chair that belonged to her. None of the servants could drive it away, and when Maravan, the king's counselor, came, he said, "This is an enchanted creature also, and it is best for us to leave it alone." So the whole company went and left the brown bear in the supper-room, seated in the queen's chair. The next morning, when he wakened, the king's son said, "That was a wonderful thing that happened last night in the supper-room. I must go off and play a third game with the grey old fellow who sits on a heap of stones at the turn of the road." So in the morning, early, he mounted and rode away, his hound at his heel, his hawk at his wrist, a brave steed to carry him whither he list, and the green ground under him. He rode on until he came to the turn in the road. Sure enough, the old grey fellow was there. "So you've come to me again, king's son," he said. "I have," said the King of Ireland's son, "and I'll play a last game with you on the same understanding as before." He tied his horse to the branch and sat down on the heap of stones. They played. The King of Ireland's son lost the game. Immediately the grey old fellow drew the cards down on the stones, and a wind came up and carried them away. Standing up, he was terribly tall. "King's son," said he, "I am your father's enemy, and I have done him an injury. And to the queen, who is your father's wife, I have done an injury too. You have lost the game, and now you must take the penalty I put upon you. You must find out my dwelling place, and take 3 hairs out of my beard within a year and a day, or else lose your head." With that, he took the King of Ireland's son by the shoulders, and lifted him on his horse, turning the horse in the direction of the king's castle. The king's son rode on, his hound at his heel, his hawk on his wrist, a brave steed to carry him whither he list, and the blue sky over him. That evening the king noticed that his son was greatly troubled, and when he lay down to sleep, everyone in the castle heard his groans and his moans. The next day he told his father the story from beginning to end. The king sent for Maravan, his counselor, and asked him if he knew who the enchanter was, and where his son would be likely to find him. "From what he said Maravan, "we may guess who he is. He is the enchanter of the Black Badlands, and his dwelling place is hard to find. Nevertheless, your son must seek for him, and take the 3 hairs out of his beard, or else lose his head. For if the heir to your kingdom does not honorably pay his forfeit, the ground of Ireland won't give crops, and the cattle won't give milk." "And," said the counselor, "as a year is little for his search, he should start off at once, although I'm bound to say that I don't know what direction he should go in." The next day the king's son said goodbye to his father and his foster brothers and started off on his journey. His stepmother would not give him her blessing on account of his having brought in the brown bear that turned her from the chair in the supper-room. nor would she let him have the good horse he always rode. Instead, the prince was given a horse that was lame in a leg and short in the tail, and neither hawk nor hound went with him this time. All day the king's son was going, traveling through wood and waste until the coming of night. The little fluttering birds were going from the bush tops, from tuft to tuft, and to the briar roots going to rest. But if they were, he was not, till the night came on, blind and dark. Then the king's son ate his bread and meat, put his satchel under his head, and lay down to take his rest on the edge of a great waste. In the morning he mounted his horse and rode on, and as he went across the waste, he saw an extraordinary sight. Everywhere were the bodies of dead creatures, a cock, a wren, a mouse, a weasel, a fox, a badger, a raven, all the birds and beasts that the king's son had ever known. He went on, but he saw no living creature before him. And then at the end of the waste he came upon two living creatures struggling. One was an eagle, and the other was an eel. And the eel had twisted itself round the eagle, and the eagle had covered her eyes with the black films of death. The king's son jumped off his horse and cut the eel in two with a sharp stroke of his sword. The eagle drew the films from her eyes and looked full at the king's son. "I am Lahin the eagle," she said, "and I will pay you for this service, son of King Conall. Know that there has been a battle of the creatures, a battle to decide which of the creatures will make laws for a year. All were killed except the eel and myself, and if you had not come, I would have been killed, and the eel would have made the laws. I am Lahin the eagle, and I always will be your friend. And now you must tell me how I can serve you." "You can serve me," said the king's son, "by showing me how I may come to the dominion of the enchanter of the Black Badlands." "I am the only creature who can show you, king's son, and if I were not old now, I would carry you there on my back, but I can tell you how to get there. Ride forward for a day, first with the sun before you, and then with the sun at your back, until you come to the shore of a lake. Stay there until you see 3 swans flying down. They are the 3 daughters of the enchanter of the Black Badlands. Mark the one who carries a green scarf in her mouth. She is the youngest daughter, and the one who can help you. When the swans come to the ground, they will transform themselves into maidens and bathe in the lake. 2 will come out, put on their swan skins, and transform themselves and fly away. But you must hide the swan skin that belongs to the youngest maiden. She will search, and when she cannot find it, she will cry out, 'I would do anything in the world for the creature who would find my swan skin for me.' Give the swan skin to her then, and tell her that the only thing she can do for you is to show you the way to her father's dominion. She will do that, and so you will come to the house of the enchanter of the Black Badlands. And now farewell to you, son of King Conall." Lahin the eagle spread out her wings and flew away, and the king's son journeyed on, first with the sun before him, and then with the sun at his back, until he came to the shore of a wide lake. He turned his horse away, rested himself on the ground, and as soon as the clear day came, he began to watch for the 3 swans.